with us with a closed door and it's just either an individual or the couple together, it's sometimes really awkward to have conversations. We're all individuals, we're all a little bit different, and so sometimes couples are kind of together on what they think should or shouldn't happen. And other times it's very clear that they're not on the same page, and the simplest way to handle that is just to not talk about it, because then we don't fight. And which makes it really awkward if we're trying to have conversations with them about giving or estate planning or something like that, because we have to talk about what to do. And so you sometimes get very awkward silences. The other thing we know is that there aren't a whole pile of great videos about people and money in the church. And so we had a group called Ted and Company out of the States do a couple of videos for us. And so this is one of my favorites.
I'm going to have to ask you a question. Would that be all right?
Fire away. That's in the high here.
Thanks.
Franklin A. Legion. Like the cold store. Stop where?
Where do you live?
842 West Milford, Pickle Lake, Ontario. Gherkin.
Excuse me?
Gherkin. Come to the Gherkin. That's Pickle Lake. If it ain't Gherkin, nobody's working.
Very good, Mr. Lee.
Like the cold sore.
Is there any history of mental illness in your family?
Got relatives on mom's side of the family. Couple of them are sick,
Oh, are you currently on any medication?
Well, let's see. There's ringworm. Nothing like a boil in the butt slave. I've got jock itch, bladder infection, ADD, panic attacks, high blood pressure, low blood pressure. I want to keep it right now.
How about any surgery?
Double hernia. Rhinoplasty, that's a nose job. Great name, rhinoplasty. Had me years ago. They were out here. The hair wax guy?
I can write it down.
Write it down. Back waxing?
Writing it down. Anything else? Have you ever been arrested?
Oh, yeah.
Misdemeanor, felony?
Misdemeanor.
Guilty?
Oh,
Have you ever experienced sexual dysfunction?
who hasn't?
And finally, how much money do you make?
Who?
How much money do you make?
Why?
It's just part of the process, Mr. Legion.
Really?
Read it. It's just a simple question. How much money do you make? What is your income?
Just answering that kind of question seems a little personal.
Next.
But it is an example of how he was asked all these very personal questions and answered them all with no issue. But how much money do you make was kind of like, whoa, that's where you hit the wall. That's where it stops. So one of the sessions that I just thought we should talk about is, rather than a teaching session, is just how do Christians talk about money? What are the things that we believe or aren't sure of or want to discuss or explore? So this is really just an open conversation. As I was saying at lunch, as my husband says, it's a good thing you like to talk, honey, because I do that, so I can blather on and tell stories, or we can, maybe there's something that jumps off the page here that can get us started. And do you know that actually most Christians don't tithe? When they do research in the States, it's a fairly low percentage of Christians that actually do give a tenth of their income. There haven't been a pile of studies in Canada, but there's really nothing to indicate it's a whole lot different here. So I know when I run into folks, we do lots of presentations, and tithing is one of the topics that comes up reasonably often. And there's two conversations I usually have. One is from folks who can't believe that anybody tithes, because how can you possibly afford to give away 10% of your income and still live? Who can afford to do that? And these folks that chat with me wouldn't know anybody that tithes, don't think that it's even possible. And I have folks on the other side of the equation who would say, well, tithing is kind of like giving with training wheels, right? And so you're giving, and it's good, and that's a great place to start, but you really don't start giving until you get way past that. That's when you can really be generous. So it's a very wide bracket of beliefs. And one of my colleagues loves having conversations about tithing, because he likes to, especially at Bible colleges, get them to go back to the Old Testament and actually read about the tithe and how many tithes there were, because there was more than one. And so they used to give between, usually it's estimated around 23% of their income. So there were 2 annual tithes and one tithe that happened every third year. So 20%, 20%, and then 30% of your wealth, your income, would be given away in a year. So it's quite a bit more than we see, and so some folks still see that as unattainable. Yeah. We have lots of interesting conversations around tithing, especially at Bible colleges. It is they're spending a lot of time in the Bible and studying the Bible, and some are very well versed in the Bible before they get to school, and others aren't. And so it's always interesting conversations when that specific scripture comes up. And imagine tithing on your quarter teaspoon of dill going into a recipe, but yet neglecting all of these other things. Well, I can tell you a story about when I grew up. I grew up in a dairy farm south of Cambridge, so the south end of Waterloo region, at the corner of Hamilton, Wentworth, and Brant counties. So we were right at the very bottom end of the county. A dairy farm. My parents farmed with my mom's parents. They purchased this particular chunk of land just after the Depression. My grandfather had, and then my mom and her sisters had been raised on the farm, and then after they were adults, my parents came back and farmed with my grandfather. And so we had about 70 cows that we milked every day, hired man, and it was fairly, pretty much a family affair. And so my sister and I, every other weekend, would get to help out with chores in the barn, milking cows and stuff like that when the hired man was off. So yeah, it was okay. But one of the things, as I said earlier, I've always been fascinated with money and always been curious about money. And so when I was probably about 14 or 15, I don't recall this piece, but I'm pretty sure I probably pestered my parents until they actually let me get involved in farm finances. And so it's a dairy farm, and you'd get a milk check from the Milk Marketing Board once a month around the 20th. And so you take that check to the bank. That was back in the old days when you actually got checks in the mail. And then you had to actually take it to the bank, and then you wrote checks out to pay all your bills. So it was around the end of the month that everything got paid. So money came in, money went out. And I remember being allowed to prepare the bank deposit slip with this milk check and some other checks that had come in, and being astounded at the size of this milk check. This was more money than I'd ever seen. I had no clue that we had that much money coming into the farm every month. Because the milk income is fairly standard. So month in, month out, it's around the same thing. And then I got to prepare all the checks for all the money going out, for all the bills, and realized that a chunk of money came back in, but it was springtime when I started, and so there's all the crop inputs, the seed and the fertilizer and vet checks and all those kinds of things. And most of that money, and in fact, the first month I looked after this, more money went out than came in. And so we actually had less money at the end of all the bill paying than we'd had before. And I very clearly remember writing out checks for my father and my grandfather for their pay, which was $800 a month. That was their pay. And how there was actually less coming in. And that's always stuck with me because of how astounded I was at the amount of money coming into the household, and realizing that it doesn't matter how much you have, it's how much you keep. And in this case, my parents had been fairly wise with their money through the fall and the winter, my grandparents, and there was some extra money in the bank account, of course, to carry them through, because spring was the big expensive time. They'd done this for years. They knew this. But for me, this was all new stuff. And so that has just stuck with me. And so I did that for a few months and, prepared all the checks and took the check to the bank and that kind of thing. And then kind of lost interest again. But it was a good life lesson, I think, for me. And I'm really quite delighted that my parents let me into that chunk of the finances, because otherwise, how does a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old have any clue what anything costs? You don't get to see the bills, you don't get to pay the bills, and you don't earn that much money if you work part-time. So it was a great gift for me to be able to do that. Yeah, and in the Old Testament, it would very much generally be seen as a blessing of God if you have a lot, and that something is probably wrong if you haven't been blessed with a lot. It's different in the New Testament. Again, I think what's the motivation for seeking wealth? The gentleman I know, a businessman, who has done a variety of things over the years, and he told me once that he thought his spiritual gift was making money. He said, it's something I'm good at. Some people are good at woodworking, some people are good at fixing cars or farming, and I'm good at making money. I'm good at he wasn't starting businesses or owning businesses, but coming in and managing them and helping to turn things around. And he said, I feel like that's my spiritual gift. It's not one of the ones that's listed, but it's something that I'm very good at, and this is obviously a skill that God has given me. But how do I use this? And so he was very intentional about one of the folks I've met who said, we have a good lifestyle. We do lots of things that we enjoy. We go on vacation. We have 2 cars. We have a nice house. We have a very good life. But when we have more than that, we work to give it away because we don't need more. And it's such a temptation for us with this income to continually have more. And so we just kind of set a ceiling and review it once a year or so, and then the rest of it just goes out. So I feel like God has given me this gift, and this is the way that I can use it best in the service of God, is to send that money back out the door. This gentleman was also very involved in a pile of charities and businesses. So when they would have building projects or capital campaigns, those kinds of things, he was often at the forefront because, again, he felt that helping people understand projects and the business sensibilities of projects and making money was one of his gifts. And so I don't think he was wrong. It was definitely something that he was very, very good at and very honest about.
Administration is one of the gifts, so you could look at it as a gift of administration.
Yeah.
To identify.
Yep, and he was quite open about. I know some other folks who feel that they recognize that they have a lot. Generally as Canadians, we do have a lot more than many people around the world. And some of the folks that I get to chat with have a lot more than most Canadians have. And some of them that are business owners make a point of hiring people that otherwise may not get that chance. So perhaps folks who don't have a great education or are in tough life situations, those or made some poor decisions in the past, and kind of give them an opportunity to have employment and experience and sort of turn their lives around. That's a way that they can sort of demonstrate their belief in the good of people and the opportunity for people to change. I know some other folks who would have things like cottages or memberships to golf courses or, tickets to various sports venues, those kinds of things, and are quite free about giving them to people that otherwise wouldn't have that opportunity. Sharing their tickets, sharing their time, inviting people to come, make use of their cottage, that kind of thing. And yet another way to say, what I have is available, and I'm fairly hands open about it. So that's been, it's been interesting to meet some of those folks and talk to them. I think the seeking wealth thing it gets really complicated because wealth is such a temptation for us. I'm an itinerant preacher, and so I preach the same sermon a pile of different places, and that's one of the upsides, is I have to write a new sermon every time. So after I had preached actually this sermon today, I had somebody come to me and say, being rich doesn't mean you don't rely on God. I said, no, I absolutely get that. It's not an either or, but it's a possibility. If I have a very limited income, a very tight budget, and my car breaks, I'm probably going to do a lot of praying about that it's either not a big repair bill or that somehow money shows up or something happens because I just can't afford this. I would write a check personally because I'm in a different situation. So yes, I may pray about this, but I'm maybe not as back to the wall as some people would be, where prayer is like that's the only thing that I can do. I can just go pay the bill. I'm fortunate that way. So I need to continue to be conscious of how that can separate me from God, or can prevent me from taking advantage of the opportunities to be in conversation with God about what's happening in my life. And so that's one of the risks, I think, of having wealth, is that it can make us more independent, it can make us more self-sufficient. I've met some other folks, especially older ones, who have simply been in the right place at the right time, really, for lack of any other. And they've owned land as the city has expanded, and they've been able to sell it for a vast amount. Their property that maybe they bought very cheaply when they were first married had appreciated to some astronomical figure. And there can be a lot of guilt about, suddenly having this amount of money and what do I do with this? And so that can be a challenge for people too, is what do I do and who do I talk to? Right? Who can have this conversation with me? Who can help me figure out what to do with this kind of situation? It's not something that I'm going to stand up and announce in church as a prayer concern. Rightly or wrongly, we just don't tend to do that. So, who do you talk to? For me, it's kind of like at lunch when we were talking about pizza, and we both like pineapple on our pizza. My husband likes anchovies, and so I think pineapple is the best pizza. He thinks anchovies pretty much is where things are at, and we just see the world differently. Those lists, one of the concerns I have is a lot of what charities do is very difficult to measure, and it varies widely depending on what they are doing. What are the costs? How involved are they with people? Is it something volunteers can do or staff can do? So if you're running a food bank, for example, you probably need a few staff, but you can have many volunteers that can help people access the food that they need and sort and stock and that kind of stuff. If you're doing an addictions program, there probably aren't a whole lot of places. You need special training. You need often to be, there are government regulations about who can actually do therapies and counseling and those kinds of things. And so you need to hire staff and pay them, and there isn't as much room for volunteers. Well, staff is an admin cost. And so the addiction program is going to have a much higher admin cost potentially than the food bank. They may both be doing excellent work at helping to change lives, but to make that decision only on that basis without looking into it further about what's actually involved, you risk, I think, not really understanding what the charity is doing or excluding some that perhaps are doing really good work with very high needs folks where there just needs to be a lot of staff with training and experience. So that's one concern I have. Personally, I would never give to a charity that doesn't have admin costs because I want to know somebody's paying attention. And so admin costs pay for in a church you can often have volunteer treasurers, but at charities they're often paid staff. I want to know that there are rules in place about that, who can cash that check, who takes it to the bank, who writes checks and what they get used for, how people get paid and that they get paid. I want staff to be paid fairly and on time, not just whenever we happen to have extra money. And so all of those things come under the admin umbrella. There are certainly charities that could do things less expensively. There are. But there are a whole lot of them that do a huge amount of work with very little and turn it into a lot of good work. So my advice is always get to know the charities that you're giving to. Get to know them well. Understand who they are, the work they do, what's involved. Are there government regulations that they have to meet that require them to employ staff instead of volunteers? Are they in an area where maybe there aren't volunteers available, and so they end up having to hire people? And get to know the people that you are giving to, because your list is probably different than my list, and probably different than most people here. Everybody's got a heart for something. God wired us all differently, and so there isn't a magic list. So yeah, the list can be a starting place, but I would still say get to know the charities that you're giving to and understand the work that they do. Many of them are run by very well-meaning volunteers. They have very few staff. Do a lot of really good stuff. I'm with you. We plan our giving for the year, and so it really doesn't make a difference who sends us what, because it all goes in a pile, and when we have our conversation at home about what we think we're going to support in the year, we can look at all that material, but yeah, the charity that sends us stuff every month, we might keep 1 month's stuff, and the rest goes in that lovely blue bin. So it seems like quite a waste. Many of the smaller charities won't do that. you need to have a fair amount of staff to kind of make that, or volunteers to make that happen on a regular basis. I know people that put all the stuff they get back inside the envelope and fire that back just as like, here's all your junk, you left it with me and it's not actually mine. It's tough for charities because on one hand they're stuck with research, and research shows that when we tell our story more often, more people will get excited. So this may not be the particular month that you're excited about Charity A, but if I keep telling you every month, and one of the 12 you might be excited and send us money. So they have to weigh that against irritating people. And some of us are more easily irritated than some others. So it's that back and forth thing. I know folks that give anonymously for that reason. They want to be off of the mailing lists. They don't want their name on the wall. We have some seniors that use our gifting account service for that reason. Sometimes it's their children that know that mom or dad write a $25 check to anybody that mails them anything. And it's not necessarily where mom or dad want to give, but you have pictures of hungry puppies or homeless kittens or children or whatever, and, the world won't change unless I do something, and there's some guilt, so they write those checks. When you actually chat with them about what they're passionate about, it's not necessarily those things. And so they've set up accounts with us where they do regular giving through us and anonymously. And in about a year and a half, they're off all those mailing lists. Mom and dad aren't getting all the mail. The charities that they care about are still getting the money.
And they're still getting a charitable receipt, even though they're giving anonymously.
They get a charitable receipt. That all happens, and it's one receipt instead of 87, whichever child ends up helping with the tax return is usually grateful for. So, there's some ways to handle that kind of stuff, but sometimes when you're on those lists, it's hard to get off of them. There's a financial planner out of Toronto called Tim Sesnick who calls it self-directed taxation. And the Government of Canada is all in favor of that. And so you can either send your tax dollars into Ottawa, CRA, and they allot them according, down to the provinces and that kind of stuff. But the Government of Canada will also allow you to give money out to charity and redirect some of that tax money, basically. You get a tax credit for that, you pay less income tax, and you can direct it to the causes you care about. And so it is that self-directed taxation of where do I choose to send my money and how much do I choose to send to which place. There are some scripture references at the back, and that sometimes can add, and look, there's no scripture references for that. One of the challenges I think for folks is that I run into when I talk to people sometimes, I give my time. That's how I give. Or I give my talents. I'm good at singing, or I'm good at teaching Sunday school, and so I do that. I don't give my money. And for many of those folks, I think it's what you said about Constantine, where he and his soldiers kept their probably their right arm, their sword arm, out of the water when they were baptized, because then they could still go out and fight wars and kill people. And there's a chunk of Christians that keep their wallets out of the water too. And so yes, I give everything to God, all for God, except for this. I'm going to hold my wallet over here because I'm not ready to talk about that with God, or I'm not ready to share that, or I'm not ready to deal with that. And so giving out of gratitude to God. When I meet people that aren't giving, that's where I encourage them to start, to give something, to pick an amount and give something. And then just explore how that feels. It might be uncomfortable for a little while. It might feel very risky and very dangerous to do that, to just let some money go. But it can be a real growing edge for folks to experience that it's okay. I can let that go, and God still looks after me, and life is okay. And to be grateful for that, truly. So I think it is a bit of both.
It's kind of the one is the same as the other, really, because you give it to.
It can be. I think it'll come back partly to faith too. For folks that are maybe newer in their Christian walk, it may be more to make a difference than out of gratitude. I think that's a growing edge. The Four Cs has a number of requirements if they will accept you and let you use their seal of approval and accountability. And it includes, tracking and having rules around who can access funds and how and what they're used for and those kinds of things. So you have some assurance at least that an outside party has looked at the policies and processes of those charities and agrees that they are in line. They'll differ, of course, as the work differs, but that they actually are useful and helpful. Imagine Canada, I think, is the other agency that does that primarily for non-Christian charities. But if you're supporting other agencies, hospital foundations, those kinds of places that probably aren't identifying as Christian, that will give you, again, some assurance that another party has looked at that and isn't seeing any signs of fraud or anything like that. Yeah. And more you can get those things online. And so if you sign up for an e-newsletter, it's pretty easy to hit delete and it doesn't feel like But no, I have a friend that she's just gone back to Kenya. She's with SIM. And when she was home on furlough, a pile of her time at home was spent trying to meet and explain and thank and look for additional folks to fund their work over there. So as much as it was a break, it was different work for her. It wasn't totally a break in time off. No, and I think there's a difference between approaching somebody and expecting, kind of pressuring them or influencing them to give, and being passionate and truly interested in something. So when I've had a great experience Sunday morning, or I've eaten at a fantastic restaurant, or found a person who's been very helpful in whatever I need, a mechanic or something, I'm quite delighted to talk to people about that person and say, hey, you need a mechanic. This is a fantastic mechanic, or this is a great place to go for dinner. It's just lovely. And that's more genuine than they're hoping you would do that, I think. But you may not quite feel that way about the charity. And that's where the challenge is, right? When you think that they do good work, but you're maybe not quite over the moon about it, or not ready to try to influence friends and family to give to the same place.
Well, charity is giving from your heart when you get left.
Yeah, we sometimes charities pay attention and understand that we're a charitable foundation and we're donor advised. So we are not deciding where the money goes. Our donors decide, and we send money wherever they instruct us. So any of the 80-some-odd thousand charities in Canada, our donors can say, can you send money here? And that's whatever they've instructed us to do. That's what we do. But some charities don't understand that or aren't really paying very close attention. And so we'll get those mailings too. And so we got one from an unnamed charity, a huge package at the office. And I mean, it was fairly expensive for them to mail. It was about $4 for them to mail this thing to us. And it was full of all kinds of information and pieces and DVDs and stuff. And in there was a letter that didn't come out and say, you owe us this money for mailing this to you, but it was really close to that kind of language. And so it's kind of, like this has set us back X cents to you. And so
read between the lines.
We think that you should give this. And I kind of went, I didn't ask for it.
Exactly.
Thank you for showing up. I mean, it's like if you showed up at my place with dinner, I'd say, great, thanks. And then you hand me a bill. I'd go, but I didn't ask for that. I appreciate the gesture, but I wasn't planning to order in dinner tonight. So
all charities.
Some are. Some are not. Yeah. It's widely perceived that way, that everybody's struggling. But that's not necessarily the case. Some charities are. Some charities have had dramatic drop-offs in donations or dramatic drop-offs in government funding. So those that are doing a lot of the social kinds of supports, homelessness, food banks, addictions, those kinds of pieces, have really, as government budgets have come under pressure, they've had their funding shrink dramatically. And so they're really under the gun to try to either find other sources of funding, i.e. donors, or cut programs and staff, which leaves folks that are in a falling economy unemployed leaves them in a worse situation than they are now. So there are those. There are others who are doing remarkably well, and funding perhaps took a dip, but is back where it was or is back up. Some people don't experience a dip at all. So there are dramatic differences in charities. And Canada Revenue Agency, charities don't pay taxes. And so one of the things, as whomever's the treasurer here would know, you have to fill out a tax return every year, basically, for the charity called the T3010. And it's a report of what money came in and where it went and that kind of thing. Every charity in Canada has to do that in order to maintain their charitable status. So at least once per year, they have to file this within 6 months of whenever their year end is. And that is public information on the Canada Revenue Agency website. So if you have an internet connection and a few minutes, you can go look up any charity in Canada and find out what are they doing. How much money is coming in, how much is going out, what are they spending on admin, what are they spending on program, what are they spending on fundraising. Some charities spend a chunk of their money on fundraising, rightly or wrongly.
Do you know what that website is?
If you go to Canada, if you do a search in a search engine for Canada Revenue Agency, CRA Charity, you'll probably come up with the Charities Directorate. And there's a bunch of information there, but one of them is a search. So if you have a charitable receipt, they must put their charity registration number on it. That's the fastest way to search. You can also search by name, but it depends on the name. So if you type in Cancer Society, there's one in many towns and provinces, and you'll get 1 million of them. If you type in Hospital Foundation, well, virtually every hospital has a hospital foundation. So be as specific as you can. But it will tell you, and you can go back years. It's not just the current year. It's back a number of years on there. So you can see what's changed. So for some charities that do relief and development work, the tsunami, earthquakes, Haiti, those had a big impact because people that don't necessarily normally support that work felt that they should do something. Haiti was just, Port-au-Prince was just flattened.